I came to the city carrying dreams, not wealth. I stayed at my aunt's house, hoping I could survive while attending college. But what I received wasn't a warm family embrace, it was endless orders. Every day I washed clothes, cleaned the house, and did the dishes like a servant who was never truly seen. When they ate their fill, I waited for leftovers. When I was exhausted, shouting came first. I stayed silent, lowered my head, and swallowed everything alone. I didn't know how long I had to endure this, but I knew one thing: this story wasn't over yet. Before we get into the story, don't forget to say hi in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And make sure to hit the subscribe button on Stories with Meaning channel so you won't miss our next interesting story. My name is Ethan. I was born in a small rural town where the roads were still red dirt, slippery when it rained and dusty during the dry season. Our house had old wooden walls that creaked whenever the sea wind blew too hard. My father worked odd jobs. My mother earned small wages helping neighbors. We didn't have much, but prayers were never absent in our nights. Since high school, I held on to a dream that many considered too ambitious. I wanted to go to college in the city, not for prestige, but because I was tired of seeing my mother count rice with worry on her face, and my father come home with slumped shoulders because his earnings were never enough. People laughed. Neighbors whispered words that cut deep. What's the point of a village kid going to college in the city? I just smiled quietly. If even dreams aren't allowed, I told myself, then what's left for someone like me? The day the scholarship announcement came, there was no celebration. I opened my email with trembling hands. One sentence stole my breath. I had been accepted. A full scholarship, free tuition. I fell to my knees, tears streaming silently. In that moment, I made a promise. I would not waste the opportunity God had opened for me. The next problem came quickly: housing. I didn't have enough money to rent a place, so I reached out to my only relatives in the city, my Aunt Margaret and her husband Richard. They lived comfortably in a large house near the coast in Los Angeles. When I first arrived, I stood in front of their house with a small suitcase and simple clothes. Margaret opened the door and looked at me from head to toe. "You're Ethan?" "Yes, Aunt." "Come in, but remember, you're just staying here." Her voice was flat, no warmth. But I nodded. I had no choice. The first days felt awkward. I tried to help however I could, but slowly I realized my position wasn't that of a nephew. I was more like an unpaid servant. Early in the morning, I was already doing laundry. By noon, washing dishes. By evening, cleaning the house. If I looked tired, Margaret's voice would rise immediately. "Don't be lazy. You're staying here for free." As for food, I learned to wait. I ate after they were done. Sometimes only half a portion of rice remained, with little more than broth. I lowered my head and swallowed without complaint. One night, as I took leftovers, Margaret stood behind me. "Poor people should know their place." The words felt like nails, no blood, but the pain lingered. I said nothing. I didn't fight back. I returned to my small room at the back of the house, lay down, and stared at the ceiling. "Just be patient, Ethan," I whispered to myself. "This isn't the end." Because the house was near the ocean, I watched fishermen every morning. That's where I got an idea. I started buying fish and selling them around the neighborhood. Morning sales, afternoon classes, night study. My body often shriveled from exhaustion, but I kept going. One afternoon, when I came home with an empty bucket, Margaret smirked. "Selling fish, that suits you." Then she added, "Remember, when you're successful someday, you owe us." I looked down. In my heart, I kept those words, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Every insult, every leftover meal, every shout, I counted them all. Not for revenge, but so I would never forget where I came from. That night, the ocean breeze carried a salty scent into my room. I closed my eyes, holding on to a dream that still felt far away. I didn't yet know that this path would one day lead me to a moment that would leave everyone speechless. Life in Aunt Margaret's house became a relentless routine. Before dawn, I was already awake. Laundry buckets waited, dirty dishes piled up. The smell of soap and leftover grease filled my mornings, if you could even call it breakfast. Richard rarely spoke to me. He walked past as if I was just another piece of furniture. When Margaret gave orders, he simply nodded, as if everything was normal. I learned quickly, silence was the safest choice. After finishing the housework, I carried my bucket of fish and walked under the burning sun. My shoulders ached, my legs felt heavy, but every fish I sold felt like one small step away from dependence. I saved every dollar in a small tin can. Each night I counted it carefully. One evening I came home late. Heavy rain had slowed me down. When I stepped inside, Margaret was already waiting in the living room. "Where have you been? The house is a mess." "I'm sorry, Aunt. It rained." Rain is not an excuse. If you're staying here, don't make excuses." I went straight to the kitchen and cleaned a floor that was already spotless. Sorry felt cheap, but I still had to say it. That night at dinner, I sat last. Only a small portion of rice remained. I took just enough. Margaret glanced at me and sighed loudly. "Take only what you need. Don't be greedy." I lowered my head. My spoon paused mid-air before I nodded. In my small room, I stared at my college books. The words blurred before my eyes. My mind was still in the kitchen. "How long do I have to live like this?" I asked myself. Then I remembered my mother's face. That memory was enough to make me open my books again. Day by day, the pressure didn't ease, it grew heavier. If I smiled because I got good grades, Margaret would sneer. "Don't get ahead of yourself. You're still just staying here." If I got sick, she would say coldly, "If you can't handle it, just go back to your hometown." But I didn't go back. I stayed. One night, I overheard Aunt Margaret talking to Uncle Richard in the living room. Their voices were low, but clear enough. "That Ethan has been here too long. Still in college," she said. "He's still studying," Uncle Richard replied shortly. "Yes, but don't let him forget his place." I closed my eyes. Those words echoed in my mind. Forget his place. I hadn't even had the chance to feel like I had a place of my own. From that night on, I began to keep records, not just of money, but of how I was treated. The days I was called lazy, the days I ate leftovers, the days I was yelled at in front of others. I kept those notes carefully, not for revenge, but so that one day, when I finally stood tall, I would know that everything I went through was real. The ocean breeze slipped through my small window, whispering endlessly. I closed my eyes with a determination that was slowly hardening. I would not stay forever in this big house with such a narrow heart. Semester after semester passed before I even realized it. My college schedule grew heavier, while the burden in Aunt Margaret's house never lessened. If anything, it increased. Whenever guests came, I had to be ready, serving drinks, clearing plates, then disappearing into the kitchen. One afternoon, I returned from campus with a heavy head. Exam results had come out. Some classes were difficult, but I passed with good grades. There was relief, but I kept it to myself. In this house, happiness often felt like a mistake. When I entered the kitchen, Aunt Margaret was preparing lunch. I stood in the corner, waiting for instructions. "Have you eaten outside?" "Not yet, Aunt." "Then later. Help first." I nodded. My stomach twisted in hunger, but my hands kept moving, washing dirty dishes. The smell of food only sharpened the pain. After they finished eating, the pot was nearly empty. I scooped what little rice remained. Aunt Margaret glanced at me. "You eat a lot every day." I swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Aunt." I took my plate to my room and ate slowly. Every bite felt heavy, not because of the taste, but because I knew tomorrow would be the same. In the afternoon, I went out to sell fish as usual. Some regular customers had started recognizing me. They called my name and greeted me warmly. Outside Aunt Margaret's house, I felt more human. "Keep going, son." That simple encouragement stayed in my chest longer than the heat of the sun. That night, while I was washing the family's clothes, my hands trembled from the cold. Aunt Margaret passed by and stopped. "Don't wash carelessly. If anything gets damaged, you'll pay for it." "Yes, Aunt." The word felt lighter on my lips, but heavier in my heart. In my room, I opened my small notebook. I wrote the date, followed by a short sentence. "Insulted for eating. Forced to wash until night. No lunch given." Each line was proof that I was still aware, still conscious of everything happening to me. One night, Uncle Richard called me. That rarely happened. I approached cautiously. "How long is your college?" "2 more years, Uncle." "Long." That was it. No smile, no encouragement. I answered softly and returned to my room. The word "long" lingered in the air. I stared at the ceiling, starting to count time. 2 years sounded long under pressure, but I knew each day brought me closer to a way out. I tightened my lifestyle. The money from selling fish I saved more strictly. I denied small desires. I refused invitations from friends to hang out. Every dollar had a purpose. One night I counted my savings and allowed myself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was hope. I closed the tin can with a pounding heart. Outside, the waves crashed against the shore without rest. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "If the ocean never gives up against the rocks, then neither will I." Entering my second year of college, my body was still standing, but my emotions were thinning. Not because I was weak, but because of constant pressure. In Aunt Margaret's house, I learned something bitter. Silence does not always mean safety. That morning, I woke up with a heavy head, feverish since the night before, but the laundry still waited, the dishes still had to be cleaned. I forced myself. The cold water made my joints ache. Aunt Margaret appeared at the kitchen doorway. "Hurry! Don't be slow." "Yes, Aunt." My voice was hoarse, but she didn't care. I still went to college that afternoon, sitting in class with blurred vision. The lecturer's words sounded distant. I bit my lip just to stay conscious. If I got sick, there was nowhere to complain. After campus, I went back to selling fish. Rain came suddenly. My clothes were soaked. Half my fish remained unsold. That day's earnings dropped sharply. By the time I got home, evening had turned dark. Aunt Margaret looked at me with irritation. "You're useless. The house hasn't been swept?" "I'm sorry, Aunt. I got caught in the rain." "Always excuses." I grabbed the broom. My hands trembled. Every movement felt heavy. That night I didn't eat. The pot was empty. I went to my room and lay down silently. My stomach was empty, but my mind was full. I remembered my hometown. I remembered my mother. If she knew my situation, she would tell me to come home, but I didn't want to return empty-handed. The following days grew colder. Aunt Margaret often compared me to other people's children. "Look at others. They're already working. You're still selling fish." I just listened. "If you're useless, don't expect anything." The words were like a light drizzle, not heavy, but constant. Yet in the middle of it all, one thing kept growing: my effort.
I began to find cheaper fish suppliers. I sold faster. The profit was small, but consistent. Every night I wrote numbers in my notebook. Those numbers became my anchor. One evening, Aunt Margaret called me into the living room. Her tone was colder than usual. "Remember, everything you enjoy here isn't free." I nodded. "When you become successful, don't forget to repay us." I looked down. The same words again. And just like before, I stored them deep inside.
That night, I sat alone by the beach. The wind carried the sound of crashing waves. I stared into the darkness and asked myself, how much longer do I have to endure a place that makes me feel small every day? I clenched the sand in my hand. The grain slipped through my fingers one by one, like time slowly passing me by. I knew my second year wasn't the end, but I could feel something approaching. Maybe a change, maybe a greater test. As the second year came to a close, I didn't feel it from the calendar, but from my body, which had grown used to exhaustion. Nothing changed in Aunt Margaret's house. The orders were the same, the tone of her voice was still sharp. Only one thing had changed. I no longer expected kindness. Every night before sleeping, I opened my small notebook. The pages were filling up. Dates, events, sometimes the amount of money I had saved that day. I didn't know what it would be for in the future, but writing things down made me feel like I still had control over my life. One morning, Aunt Margaret stared at me while I was sweeping. "You've gotten so skinny." I stayed silent, waiting for what came next. "Don't get sick. If you do, you'll just be a burden." I nodded. That wasn't concern. I knew that. That day I went farther than usual to sell fish. My legs ached, my throat was dry, but the results were decent. As I counted my money by the roadside, there was a warmth I couldn't explain. It wasn't much, but I earned it with my own effort. That afternoon I came home with leftover fish. Aunt Margaret glanced at it briefly. "Didn't sell everything?" "The market was slow, Aunt." Excuses again. She walked away. I went into the kitchen and washed the dishes. The empty pots on the rack gleamed. I already knew, tonight I would either eat leftovers or nothing at all. In my room, I sat on the floor and counted my savings. The number had grown. Still not enough to live independently, but enough to keep hope alive. I closed the tin can and hid it behind my bag. A few days later, I overheard something that tightened my chest. Aunt Margaret was talking to a neighbor on the porch. "My nephew just keeps staying here, even though he's already grown." I stopped in my tracks. "He says he's in college, but, well, you see how it is." I stepped back quietly. Those words felt sharper because they were said to someone else. I returned to my room and sat there for a long time without moving. That night, Uncle Richard called me. "Don't cause trouble." "I'm not, Uncle." "Good. Just do what you're told." I nodded. That short conversation confirmed one thing. I was alone in that house. The days leading into my third year felt like waiting for a storm. There was a tension I couldn't explain. I worked harder at selling fish. I restrained myself even more. Every dollar mattered. One night, after washing clothes late into the night, Aunt Margaret said as she walked past, "Remember, you'll pay for all of this someday." I stood frozen in front of the washing machine. The word pay echoed in my mind. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I didn't know how to repay something that was never given sincerely, but I knew one thing: my records would be my witness. And the day I would no longer stand in that house was starting to feel real. My third year finally came. There was no celebration. Nothing changed in Aunt Margaret's house except me. I became calmer. Not because things got better, but because I was preparing to leave. I began counting not just money, but time. Every morning I woke up with one thought: I won't be here much longer. My fish business began to grow. I had regular customers. Some small food stalls started buying from me. The profit wasn't big, but it was stable. Every afternoon, as I arranged fish in my bucket, I felt something new: confidence. One day, I came home earlier than usual. Aunt Margaret looked suspiciously. "Why are you back early?" "Sold out." "Don't lie." I didn't answer. I went straight to my room. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain anything. That night, I counted my savings with trembling hands. It was enough. Not much, but enough to rent a small room and survive for a few months. I sat there for a long time, staring at the money. I remembered the hungry nights, the shouting, the humiliating stares. The next day, I gathered my courage. I stood in front of Aunt Margaret and Uncle Richard. "I'm moving out." Aunt Margaret raised an eyebrow. "To where?" "To a rental place." Silence filled the room. "So now you think you're something?" "No, Aunt, I just want to be independent." Uncle Richard said nothing. Aunt Margaret scoffed. "Don't forget, you owe us." I nodded. That word again. The day I moved out finally came. I didn't have much, just a bag, books, and my savings tin. I walked out of that house without looking back. The ocean breeze touched my face. For the first time, breathing felt light. Living in a small rental room wasn't easy. The space was tight, the walls thin. But every bite of food I ate came from my own hard work. No shouting, no degrading stares. My business slowly grew. I began sending money back to my small rural town. My mother's voice trembled with gratitude over the phone. I closed my eyes for a long time after the call ended. But one thing wasn't finished. My notes were still there. Sooner or later, I knew I had to return to Aunt Margaret's house, not to stay, but to close a chapter. One afternoon, I stood in front of that house again, this time wearing neat clothes and a calm expression. Aunt Margaret opened the door and froze. I handed her a thick envelope. "This is everything you've ever spent on me." She opened it slowly. Her eyes widened. "What is this?" "Repayment." She stood there in silence. I bowed slightly and left without waiting for a response. As I walked away, my chest felt both empty and relieved at the same time. I knew that after that day, my life was no longer tied to the past. What I didn't realize was that this decision would become the beginning of a much bigger change. 3 months after I handed over that envelope, my life became calmer. In the morning, I sold fish. In the afternoon, I attended college. And at night, I counted my earnings. My business didn't explode, but it was stable. Every day there was income. Every month I could send more money back home. My body was still tired, but my mind was no longer suffocating. I rarely thought about Aunt Margaret anymore. That big house had become nothing more than a fading shadow. Now, I was focused only on my own path. One afternoon, the sky turned gray earlier than usual. I had just returned from the market when I heard a knock on the door of my small rental. It was a soft, hesitant knock, like someone unsure if they even deserved to stand there. When I opened the door, my chest tightened instantly. Aunt Margaret stood in front of me. No elegant clothes, no striking jewelry. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen. I froze for a few seconds. "Come in," I said quietly. She stepped inside slowly. My place was small, no soft couches, no expensive decorations. She stood awkwardly, as if unsure where to sit. "I came with Uncle Richard," she said softly. I turned. Uncle Richard stood outside. His face seemed to have aged in a short time. "We need to talk." I sat down. The atmosphere felt heavy. The sound of rain began hitting the tin roof. Uncle Richard spoke first. "My business collapsed." The words fell just like that, without explanation. Aunt Margaret lowered her head, her hands trembling. "We have nothing left," she said, her voice breaking. I stayed silent. My chest pounded as old memories rushed back, but I held them in. Suddenly, Aunt Margaret got off her chair and dropped to her knees in front of me. "Ethan, please." The room felt smaller. I immediately stood up. "Don't do that, Aunt." Tears fell to the floor. "I was wrong. I was arrogant. I forgot my place." I took a deep breath. The same words that once hurt me now came from her own mouth. Uncle Richard stood there in silence, his head lowered. I looked at them, not as the people who once stood above me, shouting and humiliating me, but simply as human beings who had lost their footing. Aunt Margaret slowly sat back down, looking at me with uncertainty. "Will you help us?" I didn't answer immediately. I walked to the corner, took a glass of water, and came back. "I'll help as much as I can." Aunt Margaret cried harder. "We don't deserve it." I shook my head gently. "I'm not helping because you deserve it or not. I just don't want to become the kind of person who once hurt me." I gave them help. Enough, not excessive, not binding. I also helped them find a way to stand on their own again. I didn't bring up the past. I didn't mention my notes. I didn't ask for an apology. When they were about to leave, Aunt Margaret looked at me for a long time. "You've become bigger than that house," she said softly. I closed the door after they left. The rain was still falling. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. My breathing was slow and steady. That night, I felt truly free. The days after that meeting moved quietly, like the tide pulling back without a sound. I returned to my routine, morning at the fish market, afternoon at college, night planning my future. But something felt different. My chest felt lighter, as if an invisible burden had finally been lifted. A few weeks later, I received news from my small rural town. My father was slightly ill, but my mother sounded calm. I immediately sent more money. After the call ended, I stared at the worn walls of my rental. This place was small, but it had witnessed my biggest steps. My business kept growing. I was no longer selling alone. I started buying fish in larger quantities, supplying small food stalls, and sharing profits fairly. The name Ethan was no longer known as a village boy, but as someone people could trust. At campus one afternoon, a lecturer called me. "Your grades are consistent." I nodded. "Keep it that way." That simple sentence felt like recognition I had waited for a long time. I finished college quietly. No grand graduation, no celebration. I simply called my mother. "Thank God, thank God," she repeated over and over. That night I prayed longer than usual. I remembered the path I had taken, the wooden house in my small rural town, the big house by the sea, the small back room, the cramped rental filled with hope. Everything was connected. A few months later, I met Uncle Richard at the market. His face looked calmer. He greeted me first. "Thank you," he said briefly. I nodded. There was no more distance, no more wounds to reopen. As for Aunt Margaret, I rarely heard anything, and I didn't look for news about her. What remained was only the shadow of someone who once taught me patience in the hardest way. One afternoon, I stood by the beach again. The waves came and went, just like before. I looked at the same ocean, but with a different heart. I realized life was never promised to be fair, but God always makes a way for those who endure
without stepping on others. I walked away from that shore with steady steps. There was no shout of victory, no tears of revenge. There was only me, an open future, and the quiet certainty that everything that once hurt me had led me to this point.